The story of Colombia's European colonization begins with Christopher Columbus, who famously stumbled across the Caribbean islands in 1492. Despite the nation of Colombia bearing his name, however, the first European reconnaissance in this region was from Spanish explorer Alonso de Ojeda just 7 years later in 1499. During their explorations, Ojeda's expedition would reportedly encounter many indigenous communities who traded salt, cotton, and ornamental gold, likely panned or mined from local rivers. Whilst Ojeda's attempt at settlement would ultimately fail due to disease, indigenous resistance, and food shortages, his tales of gold and riches relayed to him by local indigenous peoples would soon draw wide attention throughout Spain. Before long, myths of entire lands overflowing with wealth would draw men across oceans. While Spain initially had their attention on the Caribbean islands, this newfound potential for mineral wealth would avert their focus toward the mainland. One of the most consequential expeditions to the continent following Ojeda was led by explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who was seeking both riches and a route to the mysterious South Sea in 1513. Similar to Ojeda, however, his expedition, which began around the modern-day Gulf of Urabá, would face fierce resistance from indigenous groups upon arrival. This, along with a lack of provisions and hostile terrain, would motivate his group to seek a more viable base of operations, leading them northwards to the Isthmus of Darien, around the border of today's Colombia and Panama. It was here that they'd established the first stable Spanish settlement on the continent, Santa Maria la Antigua del Darien. Balboa's most famous accomplishment, though, would occur later that same year, when he would cross the isthmus and be the first European to sight the Pacific Ocean from the continent. Sadly, his triumph would be short-lived, however, as just 6 years later in 1519, Balboa was executed on charges of treason from the Spanish administration. Balboa's fame would then later be eclipsed by none other than his lieutenant, Francisco Pizarro, who would eventually conquer the Incan Empire, stealing huge swaths of gold and silver in the process. It was this event that truly sent the Spanish gold frenzy into high gear. In 1525, Colombia's oldest surviving Spanish settlement, Santa Marta, was founded by conquistador Rodrigo de Bastidas, but the magnetic pull of potential wealth further inland would soon draw settlers away from the town into southern regions. One such venture was led by a relatively unknown Spanish lawyer, Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada. In 1536, he'd lead 800 men along the Magdalena River in an expedition that would soon turn catastrophic. The soldiers would eventually become stranded with no food after their supply ships were destroyed in a storm. Reduced to eating local animals such as lizards, bats, and rats, along with boiled leather from their own garments, 2/3 of the group would die out within 6 months. For all their troubles, however, what they would eventually discover would change the course of history. Hidden within the eastern Cordillera of the Andean highlands lay one of the largest organised indigenous societies in the entirety of Latin America, consisting of anywhere between 300,000 and 2 million Muisca people. At first, the Muisca Confederation was hostile to the group's arrival, although their wooden weapons would ultimately prove no match against Spanish steel. Interestingly, Quesada at least initially imposed a relatively strict code of conduct against violence towards the Muisca. This, however, would be abandoned upon the discovery of the civilization's immense treasure. As a society who used gold as a material for many of their objects of ritual trade and adornment, it wasn't long before the Spaniards caught on to their wealth. The group would then proceed to capture and interrogate their most potentially lucrative targets, the Muisca chieftains, even going as far as to kill the Zipa, ruler of the southern Muisca, in an attempt to uncover their riches. Following the death of the Zipa, the Spaniards would then try and strategically manipulate his successor, Sahipa, by allying with him in a fight against an invading rival tribe. When Sahipa would not, or could not, produce the expected amounts of gold the Spanish had demanded in return though, they would turn on him, torturing him for a confession of the gold's location, before eventually killing him. Ultimately, the Spanish would still uncover immense wealth, namely over 200,000 pesos worth of gold, along with nearly 2,000 emeralds. Additionally, they'd also forcibly take numerous Muisca women for themselves, some of whom bore mixed-race children who were then baptized. By 1538, Quesada would grant this land a formal name, the Nuevo Reino de Granada, or the New Kingdom of Granada, after his home city back in Spain. Near the now ruined Muisca capital of Bogotá, he also founded a new city, which he called Santa Fe. Later, it was renamed to Santa Fe de Bogotá, with Bogotá being the Spanish approximation of Bogotá, the aforementioned Muisca city. By 1717, it would become the capital city of Nueva Granada under the creation of the region's own viceroyalty that same year. As one may guess, this city is now modern-day Bogotá, the capital city of Colombia. Meanwhile, back in 1538, the city's founding would also see the arrival of a couple of conquistador rivals who wanted to claim the territory for themselves. namely Sebastián de Belalcázar, who recently founded Cali and Popayan in 1536 and 37 respectively, along with Nicolas Ferdinand, a German conquistador in Spanish service who's credited as Riohacha's founder in 1535. Submitting their competing claims of ownership to the King of Spain, the crown would eventually recognize Quesada as the leader, making his conquest official. Beyond Santa Fe de Bogotá, perhaps equally notable this decade was the founding of Cartagena in 1533 by conquistador Pedro de Heredia, who transformed a local fishing village into a key port for Spanish trade and, sadly, slave trade for centuries to follow. The following decade, in 1542, the area that would later become Nueva Granada, along with the rest of the continent, would be placed under the viceroyalty of Peru, marking a major turning point for the region since its initial governance from Santo Domingo. Amidst these developments though, the mystery of indigenous gold reserves would persist among conquistadors for decades to come. Another myth driving the colonial obsession came in the form of a southern Muisca ritual in which their new chieftain, as part of an initiation ceremony, would be coated in powdered gold before sailing to the centre of a crater known as Lake Guatavita. Here, he would make offerings of gold and emeralds, which would be thrown into the lake. This chieftain would become known among the Spanish as El Dorado, or the Gilded One, marking the origin of this iconic title. Upon hearing the myth, attempts were made by the Spanish to drain the lake in order to uncover its supposed treasures. Though some gold artifacts were recovered, it was far from enough to quench their insatiable thirst for wealth. Instead of giving up though, the Spaniards only took the Guatavita ritual as evidence for greater treasures, perhaps further inland. Fueled by this ever-lingering potential, conquistadors and other explorers would continue to spread across the continent in search of their fortune. As tales of wealth became more exaggerated by the Spaniards, the term El Dorado would even evolve to the point of inferring not a golden chieftain, but rather an entire mythical kingdom of gold. One of the men wrapped up in this wishful search endeavour was Gonzalo Pizarro, half-brother of aforementioned Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Incan Empire. Under his belief that the jungle hid a city of fierce warrior women, supposedly the descendants of the mythical Amazons, his informants would soon find themselves deep in lush jungle terrain. No city was found, but its legend stuck. Later encounters with indigenous women in the area who matched the aforementioned Amazonian descendants in description would even inspire the name of the jungle's main river, the Amazon River, before later extending to the entire region as simply the Amazon. Meanwhile, around this same time, another conquistador, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, would lead an expedition from Mexico in search of the legendary 7 gold cities of Cibola. Once again, these efforts, however, would prove fruitless. Despite spanning thousands of kilometers across harsh deserts and plains, Coronado would find only humble indigenous villages, far from the golden metropolises he imagined. The lure of El Dorado would endure though, even beyond Spain. In the late 1500s, an English statesman named Sir Walter Raleigh would search for a golden kingdom along the Orinoco River in modern-day Venezuela. Although he failed to find El Dorado, Raleigh would go on to publish a famous account of his journey titled The Discovery of the Large, Rich and Beautiful Empire of Guyana, which would bring fame to the region across much of the English-speaking world. He'd also launch a second expedition in 1617, only this one would not end only in failure, but catastrophe. Mutiny spread, ships were lost, and expeditioners would become involved in a violent skirmish with Spanish forces, violating a peace treaty between the nations. This latter incident would then motivate King James, King of England, to have Raleigh executed in order to appease the Spanish crown. Amidst many of these pursuits for mythical gold cities and abundant wealth, however, laid a far darker reality: the brutal plundering and systematic subjugation of indigenous societies. For starters, their first meetings with conquistadors would often involve a colonial declaration claiming divine right to rule over their lands. Specifically, a legal document known as a requerimiento was read aloud to these communities, threatening violent subjugation should they resist Spanish authority and acceptance of Christianity. This, however, was often a hollow formality. Many conquistadors would simply read the requerimiento out of obligation before launching a premeditated violent attack. After the victims were ensnared, the Spanish would then utilize an institutionalized system known as an encomienda. Under this system, individual colonists were assigned professional ownership of the entire indigenous communities. Despite being considered a form of protection by the Spanish, in practice these communities were really being tasked with performing brutal labor on colonial farms and mines, while being forced to hand over their goods and pay taxes in the form of gold, food, and textiles. Before long, this system had become a driving force of the economy across the new kingdom of Granada, and by the end of the century, the imbalance had only grown more extreme. Roughly 600 Spaniards were said to have been supported by an estimated 40,000 indigenous tribute payers in Santa Fe de Bogotá alone, while in Tunja, it was claimed to have been around 200 to 50,000. As mentioned, the wealth extracted from these communities formed the backbone of much of the economy, as it was not only used to support local colonial elites, but also bring royal taxes back to the Spanish crown, who would further fuel a conquest. In response to the injustice, many indigenous groups such as the Panches, Guane, and Pijao would launch uprisings against the Spanish, only to be met with brutal military campaigns against them. Beyond violence and displacement, many would also succumb to disease brought over by the Spanish. Thankfully, the Crown would eventually choose to institutionalize a formal administrative and judicial council over the conquistadors known as the Audiencia in 1549 to impose some semblance of order and governance. Later came the appointment of the first president of the region, Andres Diaz Venero de Leyva, who led the Audiencia from 1564 under the authority of the Viceroy of Peru. Unfortunately, however, the brutal subjugation of indigenous peoples would continue for decades to come. The conquistadors were not the only group exhibiting influence over these communities, however. Alongside the conquest came missionaries who would erect churches in the region and baptize thousands of indigenous people into the Catholic faith. Over time, this Catholic faith would merge with indigenous traditions and beliefs to bring about a form of religious syncretism, although this was generally opposed by colonial authorities. By the mid-16th century, movement towards moral treatment of indigenous people was finally beginning to emerge. At the centre of this swing was a Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas had long advocated for such change, previously having renounced his own encomienda in protest. His many letters, petitions, and treatises on the subject would eventually culminate in the Spanish crown passing new laws in 1542, aiming to end indigenous enslavement by phasing out the encomienda system. While many in Spain saw these new enslavement laws as a step in the right direction, for the conquistadors it was a different story. Many had grown wealthy thanks to the forced labour and were not ready to give this up. So they just ignored the laws and would continue to exploit indigenous people either illegally or via legal loopholes. The Crown, however, fearful of a drop in revenue, had another solution: the mass importation of African slaves. Beyond being a supposed moral replacement, the Crown was also influenced by emerging pseudo-scientific ideas at the time, proposing African labour as more durable. Specifically, Africans were considered less susceptible to Spanish diseases such as influenza and smallpox, which had wiped out millions of indigenous people, partially contributing later to a population decline of up to 90% in New Granada alone by the 1600s. With these factors in mind, African labour would become the new cornerstone of the economy, especially prominent in industries such as cattle ranching, gold mining, sugar production, and urban construction. Most of this was made possible through Spain's new asiento system, which was a royal license issued to foreign merchants, allowing them to legally supply enslaved Africans to Spain's American colonies. At the centre of this economic order was Cartagena, the previously mentioned port city, which by the late 1500s had developed the region's largest slave market in its central plaza. The degree to which human life was financially formalised here was nothing short of absurd. Slaves were provided as high-interest loans, contracts were overseen by lawyers, and notaries and health workers were even employed to assess the individual's market value based on age and physical condition. The city also established an official slave tribunal, aimed at mediating any disputes over property rights. As the labour force intensified, so too did the overall transatlantic trade, and in turn, opportunities for contraband. Illicit cargo such as gold was often smuggled by local networks of merchants and even colonial officers who were bribed for a share in profits. This would eventually become enough of an issue for the Spanish crown to intervene, attempting to rein in the black market. Smugglers, however, would simply shift their operations to other ports in the region, such as Santa Marta and Riohacha. In addition to smugglers, Cartagena's wealth also attracted pirate assaults. Perhaps the most infamous of these came in 1586, when English privateer Sir Francis Drake held the city for ransom during a devastating raid. To prevent this from continuing, a top Italian military engineer, Battista Antonelli, was contracted to design and construct huge stone walls to surround the entire city. Construction took around 200 years before it was completed by Spanish military engineer Don Antonio de Arevalo. Credit must also be given, however, to the many slaves who gave their lives to work on the wall and received little to no recognition. It was also largely thanks to the slaves that Spain could afford the wall's construction to begin with, as much of it was paid through taxes on goods that slaves themselves had produced. Only further motivating the constant slave importation was the fact that many African workers faced very short lifespans. This is generally attributed to the brutal work conditions in many physically intensive industries, such as gold mining, where slaves would work to exhaustion in riverbeds and waterlogged pits. Slaves in urban areas, however, would often occupy more domestic roles, such as artisans, cooks, and family servants. In some cases, enslaved African women, along with indigenous women, would be involved in sexual relationships with Spanish men, sometimes eventually marrying. Interestingly, this would sometimes contribute to emancipation, as marriage could be seen as a rationale for freedom under the belief of the Catholic Church. Sadly, however, these relationships were frequently exploitative, and even freed slaves could often face many legal restrictions, such as not being allowed to enter certain neighbourhoods or wear certain clothing. Still, among the liberated, vibrant communities and mutual aid societies began to form, helping their members secure legal representation and defending them against re-enslavement, much to the dismay of colonial authorities. In a desperate attempt to regulate such widespread racial mixing, these authorities and elites would utilise a highly racist racial caste system. Within this system, people were codified into racial categories, creating a rigid hierarchy. Such categories included mestizo, a mix of Spanish and indigenous, mulatto, a mix of Spanish and African, and lobo, a mix of indigenous and African. This went well beyond first-generation racial mixes too, also categorising mixes of mixes, such as the cambujo, a mix between the aforementioned lobo and indigenous. At the top of this hierarchy were those of exclusive Spanish ancestry, but even among them, higher value was given to those born in Spain than the Creoles born in New Granada. Before long, the caste system would become entrenched in many aspects of society. One such example could be witnessed during Cartagena's annual Carnival celebrations, where dancers would enter the festivities in order of racial hierarchy and would be expected to perform dances stereotypical of their culture. Eventually, this would give way to newly evolved cultural traditions. The music genre of cumbia, for instance, would originate as a syncretism between indigenous and African traditions, blending instruments from both cultures, such as the African tambora drum and the indigenous gaita flute. Over time, the genre would become a strong symbol of resistance for these cultures, offering rare moments of autonomy amidst colonial oppression. Fortunately, however, a number of slaves would also find a proper form of independence from the colonial system. Thanks to several cultural uprisings throughout the 17th century, many slaves, particularly African, would escape into the interior and establish their own communities known as Palenques. The most famous of these settlements was San Basilio de Palenque, located in the modern-day department of Bolivar. Its impressive tenacity in resisting colonial authority would eventually lead King Carlos II to cave in and grant a decree in 1691 to guarantee the community's independence, a great rarity in the colonial world. The residents of San Basilio would also develop their own independent language known as Palanquero, which blended Spanish with elements of West African dialects. This language is still spoken in the village to this day, standing as a living testament of cultural endurance. Outside of the Palenques, emancipation was rare on the whole, yet certain pacification initiatives were underway. This would generally come in the form of Christian missionaries, who'd come to the continent to share the gospel with the indigenous. Despite the great challenge in dealing with multiple indigenous languages, the missionaries would eventually gain fluency and even go as far as to document the histories of their cultures into vast volumes of books, which sometimes included criticism of Spanish conquest. One Jesuit priest, Alonso de Sandoval, would gain particular notoriety for his criticism of slavery. His student, Pedro Claver, would take these ideas multiple steps further, choosing to dedicate his life to serving slaves in Cartagena, both physically and spiritually. Today, he's remembered as the patron saint of slaves, having apparently baptized hundreds of thousands throughout the early to mid-1600s. Unfortunately, however, not all Jesuits had such a noble intent. With the vast influence they'd gained over the economy, particularly as part of the Catholic Church, which had amassed extraordinary wealth by now, some argue that they behaved more like landlords and businessmen rather than spiritual leaders. Many Jesuits even had slaves on their own estates. Before long, Spain would become concerned with their growing power, particularly during the shift to the Bourbon monarchy under Charles III, who wanted tighter control of their empire. Therefore, in 1767, the monarchy would pass sweeping reforms aimed at consolidating royal power. This centralising of control had arguably begun decades prior with the establishment of a viceroyalty in Nueva Granada back in 1739. Still, these 1767 reforms took things to a new level. They included a controversial overhaul of the region's tax structure, a decision to exclude Creoles from high military and administrative appointments, a revoking of many of the church's legal privileges, and, notably, the swift expulsion of Jesuits from all Spanish territories. This all came as a huge shock across society in Nueva Granada, and would only further fuel suspicions that the Crown harvested hostility towards its subjects in the Americas. Despite the Crown's consolidation of power, however, the Church, even with its growing severance from Spain and loss of Jesuits, continued to hold great cultural influence throughout the region. Among Afro-Descendant communities, for instance, Catholic imagery was blended with ancestral African traditions to form a new syncretic belief system. These practices were often publicly denounced by the Catholic Church, who would routinely run inspections on congregations and sometimes sentence those with pagan beliefs to punishment, including public floggings and imprisonment. Interestingly, punishment for these practices, however, was often less severe for African and Indigenous peoples than it was for Spaniards. This came down to the church's belief that non-Spanish communities were less educated and therefore deserved less blame compared to the Spaniards, who should know better. The Spaniards, therefore, were among the most common group to be punished at Cartagena's infamous Palace of the Inquisition, which by the late 1700s had become a symbol of brutal religious authoritarianism. It was here that many supposed heretics would be interrogated, tortured, and killed. A percentage of Afro-descendants and indigenous people were punished here too, however, typically for acts of sorcery, witchcraft, and idolatry. Growing spiritual tensions were far from Nueva Granada's only prominent issues, however. Throughout the 1700s, external pressures such as contraband would persist in the region's port cities, and with Cartagena's stone walls still under construction, so too did the pirate raids. Another significant naval invasion would occur in 1741, when British Admiral Edward Vernon arrived with an unprecedented armada containing dozens of warships with up to 20,000 troops. Amazingly, the Grenadans, using a mix of fortification tactics and environmental warfare under the leadership of one-eyed Admiral Blas d'Alezo, eventually succeeded in repelling the British the following year. Whilst not publicised widely in Spain, the victory became a strong source of local pride for the Grenadans. With minimal assistance from Spain in the effort, it also proved to the colonies that they could both survive and triumph without constant oversight from Madrid. Even as military threats receded, however, Nueva Granada's local resilience would soon be tested by an onset of economic pressures.